Okay, in this one we're going to have a look at variables and data types. So say you have a particular piece of data, instead of having to repeat it, so for example my name Gary, instead of having the string Gary repeated over and over in your code, what you can do is store that in something called a variable, which is like a container which points at that actual value. And then instead of having to remember the name Gary and type that loosely all over the code, what you can do is you can just reuse that variable. Let's have a quick look at what the book tells us about variables and data types. So like I say, it's a named container for storing data, things like name, age or price, and then it tells us how we actually create variables. And so inside the book, have a look at this section, read about the different data types, but for now what we're going to do is we're just going to create again another PHP file, and we're just going to have a little play around with some variables so you can look at the different data types and just see how variables work and how you can add values or give values to variables and how you can also retrieve those values from the variables. And so for this one we're going to create another folder, and this will be called number 2, and it will be called variables. So number 2 variables, and then inside of here we'll make this a profile. So like profile information, for example like social media profiles or anything like that. So if you remember how we create a file, in fact I've created this as a new PHP file. Let's just do it the same way as what we did previously so we get used to adding the .php in case you're not using PHP Storm. So profile.php, again we use the opening PHP tags, and then what we want to do is create our first variable. Variables in PHP all start with a $sign, so that's how you know that you're dealing with a variable. And you can give the variables any name you like, try and keep them to a reasonable length, but also make them descriptive. So sometimes you'll see bad habits where people just have variables with names like A and you don't really know what it does. Make them descriptive, and if it includes like 2 words, we tend to use something called camel case. So for example, if I was going to say name, I'm going to say name is Gary, or name is Gary Clark, but if you wanted first name, so again this is another variable, what you would do is you would use camel case. So that means that the second word is uppercased, so first uppercase name equals, and then just Gary. And so there we've created a couple of variables, and these are both strings. So text information in PHP, and in fact in all programming languages I think, are referred to as strings. So we've created 2 strings there. Now let's have an ID, so say for example some kind of identifying number. If you're using social media or something like that, all accounts have an identifying number. So here this will be an integer, and an integer is a whole number. So you'll notice this time it's not surrounded by quotes, it is just the number. If it was surrounded by quotes it would be a string, but we don't want a string, we want an integer, i.e. a whole number. So I'm going to do my semicolon, and we'll just mark on there that this is an integer, and in fact I'll just put in parentheses just to let you know that means the same thing as a whole number, i.e. a number without any decimal point or any trailing decimals, and strings basically refer to text. Okay, next let's have a look at something called a float. And so a float is a decimal, it has decimal places, and so here we will say height is 1.8. so notice the decimal place in here which wasn't in there, and what that means is that this is a float, i.e. a floating point number, which to non-programmers will be referred to as decimals. And then next we will have a Boolean, and so these are true or false values. So here we're going to say is subscribed, and then we will say true. So again, even though it is a word, you'll notice that it doesn't have quotation marks around it. That would make it a string and your program wouldn't behave the way that you expect it to do. So we'll get onto conditionals soon where we can check true or false in order for the program to make decisions. But for the time being, just know that booleans mean true or false. They mustn't be wrapped in quotes, otherwise that would make them a string. So here is boolean, which basically means true or false. Okay, and then there's different ways of actually inspecting the values that you have in your variables. For things like strings, numbers, floats, you can actually use echo or print and it will print those out. But when you get onto sort of other types like objects and various types which we haven't looked at yet, you might not be able to use print or echo in order to inspect them because they're a little bit more complex. And so in PHP, like in all programming languages, you have something called functions, and functions are things where you can pass them some information and they will do something with that information. And so the one that we're going to use here is one called vardump, and with vardump you can pass it a variable. So the way to call this vardump function is with the name vardump and then parentheses, and then you pass it the information which you want it to inspect and tell you about. So here we want to know about this variable name, i.e. what is its value and anything else it can tell us about that. And so we will say vardump name semicolon, and then if we go and run this script, so here what I need to do is I need to move from setup. So I'm going to say cd ... / and then I'm going to drop into variables, and then I'm going to say php profile.php, and so this is the output from that vardump function. So it's telling us that name is a string, it's telling us that it has 11 characters, and then it's telling us that the value which this variable holds is Gary Clark. And so if we now want to use that name anywhere else in this program or in this script, we don't need to keep typing Gary Clark out. We've stored it in this portable container which we can assign values to and which we can retrieve values from. So now that we've done that, and now that I've shown you how to do that with name, why not have a go at actually vardumping the rest of these values. So try it on first name, try it on ID, try it on height, try it on is subscribed, and see how the information differs for each one. If you think you'd like a go at that, just pause me now and give it a go. Okay, so behind the scenes I've just done vardumps for each of these things, and then if I go to the terminal, php profile.php, then as you can see it prints all of those things out. So we already know the first one, name is a string with 11 characters and a value of Gary Clark. ID is an integer, so int 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Height is a float with a value of 1.8, and is subscribed is a boolean, so bool for short, int for short, and that has a value of true. Okay, so that's variables. Now on their own and just printing them out like that, you're not really going to see the true value of them. But as we progress through the book and we start using more and more variables and storing values in them, changing values, adding values together, things like that, you'll get to see the real power of them and the real sort of necessity of them in programming in PHP.